Hello, my name is Mike Walkden. I'm an Associate Director with WSP, and I'm going to be talking about cliff sensitivity to accelerating sea level rise with particular reference to the coast between Blue Anchor and Watchet. I'll be introducing you to two studies, one for Somerset County Council looking at the route of the B3191, and also a research study that we're just coming to the end of for the DEFRA EA Managed Research Programme. And in that research, we've looked at the entire coastline of Wales and England, divided up into 82 regions, and then we've used numerical models to try to explore how variations in things like history of sea level rise, tidal range, wave conditions might influence the way that the cliffs in these regions will respond to future increases in sea level. And this, of course, has included the West Somerset frontage, and so we've taken the results from those simulations in region 55 and applied them to the study for Somerset Council. So this shows us the cliffs within that study for the council, and it includes 4 behavioural units, which I've called Blue Anchor, Warren Farm, Holiday Village and West Watchet. The cliffs within these different units are quite different. There's a wide range in geology and the sediments within the cliffs, but there are also some important similarities. So the cliffs are all actively retreating. They're leaving behind them wide intertidal short platforms, which are then playing an important role in regulating the retreat of the cliffs. And there are beaches throughout the frontage, but they tend to be quite shallow and small and are not therefore having a dominant effect on the erosion of the cliffs. Now, in any study of this sort, the most important information really that you can get is the information on historic recession, and we've gone about gathering that through a transect analysis. We've laid a transect every 10 meters, and then we've compared Ordnance Survey data from 1902 with modern aerial photography. And that worked well in all areas except in one particular patch in the Warren Farm unit where there's a large landslide that's been there for a long time, which rather undermines the analysis in that area. And so this graph shows the results of that analysis. We have one measure of recession distance between 1902 to 2018, that's the vertical axis, for every one of the transects. We had about a little under 400 transects along this sort of 4-kilometer coast. And then I've grouped each of those results using colour to represent each of the behavioural units. And what's interesting about this data is that you can see, well, clearly each colour, each unit has its own mean value, but there are clear differences as well in the variability about that mean from unit to unit. And we've done some simple statistical analysis on that data to calculate a mean value and a minimum and a maximum for each of the units. So that table tells us important things about how the cliff has changed historically, but it would be wrong-headed, of course, to assume that that sort of change that we've seen historically will persist into the future, because we know sea level rise is a primary driver of cliff retreat. And we also know that sea level rise is going to accelerate. And this graph gives us a sense of how high that might be. So the black dashed line represents historic sea level rise up to the present day and also projects it into the future. The blue line is taken from the work of the United Kingdom Climate Projections Project 2018, so UKCP 18. And this is one of their sea level rise scenarios. It's at the upper end, the upper limit of the what they call the RCP 8.5, which is a high sensitivity projection. And we can see towards the end of this century that under this scenario, seas are rising at about 6 times their historic rate. And that begs the question, will the cliffs be retreating 6 times faster, or will the sensitivity be greater than that or less than that? If we look to guidance for a steer on how to deal with this problem, we tend to be directed either towards the Brunn rule or the modified Brunn rule, as is the case with the Soft Cliffs manual. And both of these methods are sediment budget based, and I think that introduces significant problems when you try to apply them to sites like these in Somerset, where there is a beach, but it's not very big. And this table records some of those issues. So the modified Brunn rule doesn't deal with the fact that a shore platform slope is likely to adapt as the rate of sea level rise changes. It deals in quite an implausible way with variations in geology. You can get the same result in terms of absolute increase in recession. You can get the same result for a clay cliff as for a granite cliff, which might represent a very, very modest response in terms of the clay, but an extreme response in terms of the granite. And that's unhelpful. It doesn't account for the fact that it takes time for sites like these to reshape in response to a change in sea level, unlike, say, a dune beach system which can reshape very, very quickly. It doesn't account for growth in wave heights, which is one possible outcome of climate change. And it doesn't account for the long-term historical effect of millennial changes in relative sea level that will have occurred at the site. And so we've been trying in our research project to develop a method which has these strengths, that deals with these things that the modified Brunn rule lacks. And I should say we're coming to the end of stage 2 of that research project. The first was led by Royal Haskoning DHV with WSP as a partner, and WSP has undertaken stage 2 with help from the British Geological Survey, the Channel Coastal Observatory, University of Sheffield, and the United Kingdom Climate Projections Project. We've taken a numerical modelling approach. We've used the modelling tool, Soft Cliff and Platform Erosion, SCAPE, and we've run a very large number of idealised simulations for each one of 82 contiguous regions of the coast of England and Wales, and in this way we've tried to account for variations in things like history of relative sea level change, tides, waves, and shore orientation. And this slide gives you an example of one of our forecasts, one of our idealized forecasts. What we're looking at here are a series of shore profiles beginning in 1800 and ending in 2100 in 20-year time steps. And we can see sea levels changing throughout the simulation. So mean sea level is indicated by a magenta dot, mean high water spring by a cyan dot, and both of these dots, pairs of dots, are rising up each profile as the sea level rises. And we can see that the profiles are responding to that rise by changing shape and increasing their recession rate. We know that the recession rate is increasing because the lines are getting further apart. And what we've done is to calculate a sensitivity indicator for every future year from 2020 onwards by simply dividing that future recession by that year by the recession that occurred across a baseline period, which we've defined as 1920 to 2020. And here we can see the kind of results that we get, this column of green numbers on the right hand side. I should stress that these represent movement of the cliff toe rather than the cliff top, and I should also stress that these have been conservatively estimated. So given the large number of uncertainties that surround the behaviour of these types of cliff systems, it seems rational to try to predict results which are more likely to overestimate their sensitivity than to underestimate. And we've got these sorts of results for all of the sea level rise projections, and for most of the coastline of Wales and England. We've modelled the entirety of the coastline, but we had some issues with our representation of Holocene sea level change in some northern areas. And so, yeah, but we have results for most of England and Wales. And this slide shows what we get when we apply those results to our site in West Somerset. I won't go into precisely how that's done, but it's basically a matter of multiplying the sensitivity indicators by a historic recession distance. And because we have three estimates of historic recession, a mean, a maximum and a minimum for each of our units, we get three curves for each of our units, which describe a mean estimate shown with a solid line and an upper and lower limit shown with a dashed line. And these bring out some of the characteristics that we saw from the transect analysis data and put them to use. So a blue anchor, for example, in red on the left hand side, you can see three very steep lines showing lots of recession, which are quite tightly clustered because there is little variability in the recession rate. At Warren Farm, we have much flatter lines because the overall rates of change are so much less, but the lines are more divergent because there's greater variability. And then similarly in Holiday Village, we have even flatter lines because the historic recession distances were so small, but the variability is still high. Now the blue lines in each of these graphs, those represent the years that we're particularly interested in for this study, the 2050s, 2080s and 2120s. And of course we can pull off recession distances from these graphs in order to put lines on maps. And this slide shows what we get when we apply those results to our site in West Somerset. I won't go into precisely how that's done, but it's basically a matter of multiplying the sensitivity indicators by a historic recession distance. And because we have three estimates of historic recession, a mean, a maximum and a minimum for each of our units, we get three curves for each of our units, which describe a mean estimate shown with a solid line and an upper and lower limit shown with a dashed line. And these bring out some of the characteristics that we saw from the transect analysis data and put them to use. So a blue anchor, for example, in red on the left hand side, we can see three very steep lines showing lots of recession, which are quite tightly clustered because there is little variability in the recession rate. At Warren Farm, we have much flatter lines because the overall rates of change are so much less, but the lines are more divergent because there's greater variability. And then similarly in Holiday Village, we have even flatter lines because the historic recession distances were so small, but the variability is still high. Now the blue lines in each of these graphs, those represent the years that we're particularly interested in for this study, the 2050s, 2080s and 2120s. And of course we can pull off recession distances from these graphs in order to put lines on maps, which is what we have here. And these are cliff top positions for our different epochs. And I've chosen this particular area because it shows the transition between the blue anchor unit and the Warren Farm unit. And so you can see those really high recession distances in blue anchor with the tightly clustered lines compared to the rather lower recession distances at Warren Farm, but the greater variability in the cliff top line. So those slides give you a sense of how the results of the research can be used to put lines on maps. But I should stress that the method has been developed to deal with the quite common situation where you have quite a length of cliff to deal with, which might have a lot of behavioural units within it, and you've got quite limited resource to put to the problem. So it's intentionally designed to be quick to apply and also to have large coverage to be applicable to large areas. So to achieve that, of course, we've had to make simplifications in the modelling, we've had to draw assumptions and use idealizations, and with that approach come limitations, and I'll leave it to you to read through those which are listed here. I'll just focus on the last point, which is that if the study can afford it, then it's better to build a bespoke model of the site, and should Escape be considered an appropriate tool for that, then it's freely available to download from GitHub and to use. And to turn now to the strengths of the method, well, I won't go through each of these bullet points, but I will focus on the table, which really makes the point that there's good complementarity between the new method and the modified Brun rule. So where one might be expected to perform less well, the other might be expected to be rather stronger. And so this is not about saying the modified Brun rule should not be in the toolbox. It's more about saying, well, the toolbox looks pretty empty, so we need more tools in it, and these should be rather different to the tools that we've currently got, so that we've got more adaptability. And I hope that this will be seen as a positive contribution in our efforts to really get to grips with this really, really important question of how sensitive our close coastlines are going to be to accelerating sea level rise. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the support and contributions of the people and organizations listed on this slide, and to say that the results of the research are going through the Environment Agency's normal review processes, and I'm not quite sure when they'll be available for public release, but I hope that will be in the next few months. Thanks very much for your attention.